Welcome to the Colonial Society and a special program from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the awarding of the 2023 Peter J. Gomes Memorial Book Prize to Dr. Andrew M. Wehrman, Associate Professor of History at Central Michigan University, for his book, The Contagion of Liberty, The Politics of Smallpox in the American Revolution. My name is Kenneth Chanlai. I'm the Director of Research at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and would also like to thank Professor Bob Allison, who's the President of the Colonial Society, for hosting this ceremony in your beautiful building here on Beacon Hill. After some opening remarks from Catherine Allgore, the President of the MHS, we shall also ask Professor Wehrman to say a few words, and after that he will join Professor William Fowler in a discussion about the book. So allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers today. Our award recipient is Andrew M. Wehrman, Associate Professor of History at Central Michigan University. He was previously the John G. and Jean McCoy Assistant Professor of History at Marietta College. The Contagion of Liberty is his first book. Professor Wehrman received the 2008 Walter Muir Whitehill Award for his article titled The Siege of Castle Pox in the New England Quarterly, and his writings have appeared in various publications, including the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and NBC News. And he's been quoted in numerous venues as well, including Time, New York Magazine, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Voice of America, and the Chicago Tribune. Professor Wehrman will be joined in conversation by William Fowler, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at Northeastern University. Professor Fowler is the author of numerous books, including Under Two Flags, The Navy and the Civil War, Jack Tars and Commodores, The American Navy, 1783 to 1815, Samuel Adams, Radical Puritan, and Empires at War, the French and Indian War and the Struggle for North America, 1754 to 1763. Professor Fowler has also held a number of posts and honors and continues to be involved with a number of organizations, including George Washington's Mount Vernon, the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society, the Paul Revere Memorial Association, the Old North Church Foundation, the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, the Boston Marine Society, and the New England Quarterly. He was formerly president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, as well as the former director of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And now to the awarding of the ceremony, the awarding of the prize. It is my pleasure, it's always my pleasure, to introduce the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Catherine Allgore.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone here in our beautiful building here at the Colonial Society, and everybody online to join us to present the Peter J. Gomes Memorial Prize. And it was, of course, in honor of the late Reverend Professor Peter J. Gomes. Reverend Gomes was the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister of the Memorial Church at Harvard University. He was also an overseer, elected fellow, and board member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. A zealous preacher, orator, and lover of history, he often quoted the book of Romans 12:2 and urged people to be, quote, transformed by the renewal of your mind. Sound historical scholarship written for a broad audience helps both transform and renews one's mind. And in that spirit, and in the memory of Reverend Gomes, who passed away sadly in 2011, the Massachusetts Historical Society presents this award for the best nonfiction work in the history of Massachusetts published in the preceding year. This year's competition was robust and included 12 works that covered topics ranging from art and urban history to biographies and cultural studies. The works spanned centuries of history from the 17th to the 20th centuries, and the selection committee was entirely outside judges and unanimously agreed to award the prize to Contagion of Liberty. And I'd like to read a little bit of an excerpt from the statement that these scholars, the judges, put together for us, and it'll, I think, give you a good idea why this is a most worthy recipient. Andrew Wehrman's The Contagion of Liberty provides a new and timely examination of smallpox in British America that focuses on the politics of public health measures. Contagion builds on other works on smallpox during this period with accounts of the emergence of the virulent virus, the role that slavery and racism played in inoculation, and General Washington's critical shift from opposing to supporting inoculation of Continental Army soldiers. But Wehrman moves in an interdisciplinary direction to examine the political structures, class conflicts, and personal disputes that shaped how port towns, particularly in Massachusetts, moved from banning inoculation to insisting on universal inoculation, a move later followed by General George Washington. This work is also unique in examining changes that came with the development of vaccinations during the early republic after the war. And the result is an outstanding study of the past that can help us better understand how Americans have managed public health emergencies. The Contagion of Liberty is an important and timely study that provides deep insights for scholars seeking to better understand the social, cultural, and particularly political circumstances of inoculation and public health management, including its implications of how Americans understood federalism and competing definitions of liberty itself. The author also gives general readers much to consider in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm sure you're having the same feeling as I'm reading these words. When I first assembled them, it just couldn't seem more timely, but especially to how communities respond to public health crises, our obligations to one another during these moments, and our expectations of government at the local, state, and federal levels. The book's close attention to developments in Massachusetts, towns like Marblehead and Boston, and its broader analysis of public debates about managing smallpox between the colonial era and the early national period makes The Contagion of Liberty an ideal choice for this year's Gomes Prize. We congratulate Professor Andrew Wehrman on this indispensable and essential piece of scholarship. Professor Wehrman, on behalf of the Massachusetts Historical Society, I present you with the Peter J. Gomes Memorial Prize. And here it is, folks. I'm going to do you a favor and not give it to you, so you don't have to stand there and hold it. But there is a little token of our esteem and respect that you can just tuck away in a pocket. So there we go. So I think you get to sit down now, I'm guessing, and you'll be joining. So I'm going to hand this over to my distinguished predecessor.
I think I have.
Oh, you've got a mic. Good for you. And we'll have a conversation. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, Andy, if I may,
Sure.
Congratulations. A well-deserved prize. I must tell you, right at the very beginning, when I began reading this book, the issue of smallpox in America is hardly a new one. There's a shelf full of books about that. And I wondered what I was going to find in your book. And what I did find was lots of new information. Not only new information, but new connections. You managed to weave this story of smallpox over several decades, not just in the early 18th century, into a wonderful story, an imaginative story. I think, like all good history that we read, when we read good history, it forces us to reassess and revalue what we've read before. So that really does that very well. Well, let me ask you the obvious question. Did COVID have anything to do with your interest in this topic?
Sort of. COVID happened at the very end. So I had been researching this book for more than a decade. Previously, it was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Northwestern. I came to Boston and to Marblehead. I had a fellowship at the Boston Athenaeum right nearby here when I started some of the archival research. That was 2008, 2009, so way before anybody had ever heard of COVID-19. It was a long process, and the book became way too long. It was twice as long as it is now, and I had to edit it back. And so those final revisions were written during COVID. So I had a book contract that came through in the beginning of 2020, and then we talked about COVID. One of the reasons that it was under contract and that Johns Hopkins was excited about it was because there was this disease that everybody was starting to talk about that we realized was going to affect things. And the final manuscript draft, and I do think COVID, it didn't change anything about what I had researched, but it gave it a little bit more of an answer to the sort of so what question of why does this matter today? Because of course it was interesting and it happened in the past, but it gave it a little bit more of an edge or a reason why current readers would be interested. When I started, people were similar, saying, why smallpox? Why does this matter? And I think some of the debates and arguments that I found just rang so much more clearly afterward. I thought that I was writing a book for people that had, never really experienced a quarantine, never had town hall debates over inoculation, whether it was time, and that I was having to explain the experience of quarantine to people, and then that's what the last revision was about. I don't need all that because we've the audience of readers has experienced some of that.
Let's get back to smallpox for a minute.
Yeah.
For my sake, and maybe for those folks in the audience, first, why was smallpox so feared? And secondly, and this may seem an obvious question, but I need to sort it out in my own mind, what is the difference between vaccination and inoculation?
Those are big questions. So smallpox was the most feared disease of the 18th century, probably the 17th century. Also, by some measure, it's the greatest killer of mankind in history when you consider the absolute destruction of native populations following Spanish conquest. And so smallpox was especially feared by Europeans. They saw that the damage that it was doing to Native Americans firsthand. They saw the damage it was doing to themselves. And then the fact that it's such a visible disease, whereas COVID did its work largely invisibly. Sometimes you'd have to take a test to know if you had it or not. Whereas smallpox, there were no asymptomatic cases of smallpox. If you got it, you knew, and it was visible on your face, on your hands, on the exposed parts of your body. The mortality rate of smallpox was as high as just about any disease has been. The time of the Revolution, the time I'm talking about, probably a 15 to 20% mortality rate. A higher mortality rate for very young children, infants, and older people, but a terrible disease. And then just the visible scarring and the pox and things just made it so much more feared than other diseases that could be really dangerous, dysentery and things like that. Smallpox was always, they called it the king of terrors. And it really was. The only saving grace of smallpox, if it had one, and it's just because of the biology. If you survive smallpox, your body would recognize it. It was it's a large virus as viruses go. It's bigger than a COVID virus or a rhinovirus of colds and things. It does really brutal damage to the body, but your T cells, they'll recognize it after it passes through. So you can only get it once. The damage that it does is what it does. You can't get it twice. You're immune for life after having survived it. And it's that part of smallpox that makes inoculation work. So inoculation was the process of purposely infecting someone with smallpox, usually via a small incision in the arm, a little bit of the smallpox matter taken from a smallpox sore would be inserted into the skin, patched up. In about a week, the patient would start feeling sick, would get a few pox usually, but not as many as you would a natural smallpox case. It would be much easier, much more survivable. The mortality rate for inoculation was about 1% usually. Some inoculators got it lower than that. But much more survivable. So and then you'd be immune for the rest of your lives. Inoculation, and I think we owe, especially in Boston, thanks everybody in this room, we're all gathered together, owe thanks to an enslaved black man named Onesimus, who introduced this concept, which is really foreign sounding, getting smallpox on purpose, right? Getting the most dangerous disease, the most feared disease, and taking a little bit of the disease and giving it to yourself or your child, making them sick with it in order to give them immunity is just crazy. And Onesimus introduced that famously to his enslaver, Cotton Mather, before 1721. And in 1721 was the Boston smallpox epidemic. And Mather sends letters out to all the doctors in town, all the ministers, saying, we need to use inoculation to ward off this disease. 1721 was when they were first doing experiments in England, and those were the royal family in Britain. In Boston was the first place where ordinary Europeans decided to try this technique, and that's really significant. Of course, inoculation was known, as Onesimus explained, in parts of Africa. It had been common over generations in India, in the Middle East, in Asia. Europeans were the last to know about inoculation, and they really didn't like that fact, right? They argued about it in the papers and the debates. If this was such an important invention, why didn't white people come up with it, right? How would a black man have a scientific innovation that we don't know about? And they didn't always trust it. So there were a mistrust. About 300 people in Boston decided to go through with it, and they proved it. It was much better mortality rate than the disease in the natural way. Boston kept very good numbers. They kept track of who got sick, how many died. Historians like me can track. And then in every subsequent outbreak of smallpox, more people chose inoculation. That's really what the book is about, is how this demand grows over time. And it was Boston's results from inoculation that were printed, published, spread among across the colonies, across Europe even, that the experiments here were so important. So that's inoculation. Vaccination comes about right at the end of the 18th century. A doctor in England, Edward Jenner, publishes a report showing that cowpox does the same thing as smallpox, or basically, but a little bit better. So the problem with inoculation is if you inoculate a patient, they get a little bit sick, and they're contagious. They can spread natural smallpox to other people. So if you want your grandmother to be inoculated to make sure she's safe, well, then everybody else in the household that comes into contact with grandmother needs to be inoculated too, or else they'll catch natural smallpox from her. So the whole house. And then if your house is getting inoculated, well, then the neighbors are going to hear about it, and they're either going to want to stop you because they don't want to get sick, or they're going to want to inoculate too. One of the themes of the book. The beauty of vaccination is when you use the cowpox virus, it's not contagious among humans, but it does provide immunity to smallpox. So by using cowpox and inserting it into the skin the same way, you barely get sick at all. The mortality rate was almost zero. You would become immune to smallpox. It doesn't turn out for life. You'd usually have to be revaccinated. They would find out about that later. But you wouldn't transmit it to anybody else. You can go get vaccinated. You can return to work. You can sit in the pews at church. It's fine. You're not going to infect anybody else. So inoculation is unique. It was more dangerous, but it also fostered more of a community spirit because, as Boston figured out, if a few people were inoculating, you either needed to stop them or open it up for the whole community to do it at once, which is how Boston chose to do it multiple times.
Let me ask you about the reaction of the medical profession. When I say profession, I mean that clearly there were some people who were in the medical profession who were not doctors.
Yeah.
the duty of care, it seems, sometimes conflicted with the desire for profit. And in particular cases, it turned out to be rather interesting. And I wonder if you might comment on, I think, a person like Benjamin Waterhouse, who was much revered in this community, okay, but you have some things in there to say about Benjamin Waterhouse that are not quite so complimentary. And I also think of John Cochrane, a physician that served with General Washington. And so I wonder about the medical profession's reaction to this scourge of smallpox. On one hand, they wanted to cure it, but on the other hand, they wanted to make a profit.
Isn't that the way it is? So, inoculation or vaccination later, but inoculation was big business for doctors. That this was a medical procedure that was high in demand, really easy to perform, and you could charge a lot for it. And that was one of the early controversies of inoculation generally, was that doctors charged high prices for it, hospitals charged high prices for it, and it kept out the poor. There are disputes in my book, the burning of a hospital in Marblehead, where the poor were left out of this calculation, and they weren't anti-inoculation, like they weren't anti-vaxxers. They weren't angry at the cure, but they were angry that they couldn't afford it, that they were being kept out of it. And so there was that problem. But doctors were using it to turn profits. In some communities, it became a problem where doctors would oppose a general inoculation of the whole city because they wouldn't make as much money that way. Cities would do contracts, and they would say they would say they have to make vaccination free for all, which was very popular, but the doctors would say, well, how are we going to make any money off of that? That was Benjamin Waterhouse. So Benjamin Waterhouse was the first in the United States to learn of vaccination. He has a personal correspondence with Edward Jenner. He's the first in America to learn that vaccination is coming. And then he's writing to Jenner, he's writing to a couple of other doctors in England trying to get the vaccine. And he gets it first. Other people are trying to get it. It doesn't travel very well, the vaccine. It spoils over the ocean voyage. If it gets hot at all, it doesn't have any potency. And so Waterhouse gets it, and he realizes, this could be good for mankind. Jenner doesn't charge anything for it in England, but Waterhouse gives into that greed. And not only does he charge patients for vaccinations, he makes other doctors pay him to use his vaccine. He starts a vaccination franchise system where doctors have to pay him to get access to the vaccine. It really pisses off every doctor in Boston, the Massachusetts Medical Society. They're all extremely angry with Waterhouse. And then it's also a medical disaster, because back in Marblehead, a place where, for some reason, all of these inoculation and vaccination controversies end up, there's a terrible mistake where a doctor who's trying to evade Waterhouse's monopoly gets what he thinks is vaccine from another source, from a sailor. And it turns out it wasn't cowpox, it was smallpox. It was what you would normally inoculate with. And so he goes around and he inoculates patients, but they think they're vaccinated. So they circulate like you do if you think you're vaccinated, and it creates a new epidemic of the disease. This was really, I forget what year it was, 1802, something like that. And it causes many in Massachusetts and even throughout the United States to mistrust vaccination. They don't trust the doctors trying to make money off of it. That inoculation seemed to work pretty well. This vaccination is prone to mistakes, and it causes Boston and Massachusetts and places not to adopt vaccination nearly as quickly as they would have otherwise. Waterhouse admits it, admits that he's made this mistake, but still tries to recover his own reputation. He starts writing letters to Thomas Jefferson and to other people. He's still remembered as the Jenner of America, as the founder of vaccination in the United States, but he can't shake it within Boston what he did, how he tried to make money off of epidemics. It's part of his.
Jefferson doesn't come out entirely well in all of this either. That he was rather parsimonious in the way he would have the inoculation distributed.
Jefferson too. I mean, Jefferson's remembered. If you know anything about Jefferson and vaccines, you might know that Jefferson wanted to send vaccine material with Lewis and Clark, and he didn't. And that Jefferson was an enthusiastic supporter of vaccination. He vaccinated personally enslaved people at Monticello, but Jefferson was not a believer in public vaccination, in that he never, as president, recommended vaccination to the public. He never talked about it. In general, he just hoped that it would spread amongst the educated people in America without having to fund it, without having to do much towards it. There were people writing to Jefferson at the time trying to establish vaccine agencies. There were towns, there's a town called Milton in Massachusetts, which was the most pro-vaccination place in America. They were constantly writing letters saying every town in America needs to vaccinate all of its people. And then you can do annual vaccinations. We can just vaccinate children every year, and there'll be no more smallpox. We will make it extinct. There were many people in America that thought smallpox could be completely eradicated if they did some of these vaccination programs annually. Jefferson and then President Madison afterwards never took heed of any of these ideas for general vaccination programs. They supported it privately, for sure, private vaccinations, which is what the doctors liked. They can turn profits that way. But the public vaccination programs, it took much longer to get off the ground. Boston eventually starts that in the late 1820s and 1830s, starting to vaccinate school children. But it had been a much older idea. That's part of what I tried to think about when I was writing it, because there was so much enthusiasm for inoculation. After Washington inoculates the Continental Army, whole towns and cities are inoculating big populations in the 1790s, but that enthusiasm wanes after the Revolution for a number of reasons. One of which is this conflict between the profits of doctors and whether this should be something that people seek privately, if people should just choose to be vaccinated on their own, or if there should be real public health campaigns.
I thought the story of Milton was quite remarkable. If I remember right, at the time, physicians were charging something like $3 for inoculation, and the town of Milton managed to do it for 25 cents.
Right.
Really, very remarkable difference. Also, you mentioned Washington. Washington had a capacity to learn, apparently. And I like the relationship between Washington and John Cochrane.
Mm-hmm. So, as Catherine mentions, I think a lot of us have learned through the pandemic. When I started writing the book and I would talk about George Washington inoculating the Continental Army, I think a few people knew about it, but it was not part of most biographies of George Washington. It wasn't a part of most histories of the American Revolution, and I checked, because that's the kind of thing I do when I go into a library or a bookstore and there's a book on the American Revolution. I check the index to see how big is the smallpox section, and usually there's maybe one page or something like that. And so it wasn't. I think now we know about it. But Washington was opposed to it. Washington was from Virginia. Virginia was, even though it had a high population, it didn't have large cities or towns. And so Boston's experience, where every decade or so they were debating inoculation, they were combating epidemics of smallpox fairly frequently, didn't happen in Virginia. Virginians were spared from smallpox most of the time. And so Washington hadn't had much experience with urban public health. He didn't think that it was necessary to to inoculate the troops at first. I don't think he really understood what the process of inoculation was at first, at least not in a detailed fashion before the war. He had had smallpox himself as a young man when he visited Barbados, but and survived it. And I think he thought that if soldiers got it, these 17, 18, 19-year-old kids, that they'd be able to handle it sort of like he did. They'd do everything to prevent it, to quarantine it. But inoculation, that's something that rich people were going to seek out for themselves and for their families. It seemed like something that the Army didn't need. Meanwhile, the soldiers themselves are demanding it. Soldiers' wives are demanding that their husbands who are going into the Army get inoculated. There's this pressure building. Doctors are demanding it within the Army. They're saying, we can do it, we can pull it off, we can inoculate all the soldiers. We've done mass inoculations. At this point, Boston has done mass inoculations where they've inoculated 5,000-6,000 people at one time. And so it wasn't until Washington crossed the Delaware, was pushed back into New Jersey, that a doctor, an inoculator from New Jersey named John Cochrane, became part of Washington's inner circle. Washington trusted Cochrane. He had fought in the French and Indian War. He was a relative of Philip Schuyler by marriage. Washington trusted this guy, and Cochrane was one of the biggest inoculators in the colonies. He advertised in newspapers across the colonies for his inoculation hospital in New Jersey. He bragged that he had never lost a patient. And I think there were a few factors that changed Washington's mind on inoculation. One was that he had Cochrane by his side, and Cochrane was assuring him that they could inoculate in large numbers, they could do it quickly, they could do it discreetly. Helped him understand the logistics of it and what it would actually look like. But another was Martha Washington. Martha Washington had herself inoculated in the summer of 1776. Washington wrote that he doubted that Martha would go through with it. He knew she was interested in it, but he said he doubted her resolve. Well, she did it. She went to Philadelphia, had herself inoculated, went through it very easily, and Washington really paid attention to her progress through the disease. And for the first time in his letters, he mentions the word inoculation. He used to always call it taking the smallpox, which sounds much more dangerous, to take the smallpox. But he starts using inoculation after Martha goes through with it. He also kind of follows the details. As I said earlier, about 7 days after your inoculation, the pox would begin to show. Inoculation patients usually counted their pox as a sign of progress. If you had 20 or 30 pox, you had a pretty good success. If you had hundreds, it was bad. And so he was paying attention to Martha's reports and kind of saying, okay, if Martha Washington can go through this pretty easily, maybe these 18, 19-year-old soldiers can get through it too. So that was part of it. But yeah, Washington was firmly against it. He punished inoculators. He called them traitors to the country before this, would publish their names in the newspapers. There was an inoculator in New York City who went to jail, and Washington fully supported his jailing because he had inoculated some Massachusetts soldiers. And so it was a huge turnaround. I call it an about face in my book, that Washington, didn't dig in his heels about opposing it. He softened up after Martha's inoculation with Dr. Cochrane. He listened to him, and he changed his mind. He writes these letters. He writes letters in February of 1777. On February 5th, he writes letters to John Hancock and another one of his generals saying, the doctors think we can do it. I just don't think we can. I think inoculation would be too difficult for the Army to manage. Then the next day, he has that paragraph crossed out, and he writes to John Hancock, and he writes to Horatio Gates, was the other guy he was writing to, and he says, I've changed my mind. Let's do it. Let's go for it. They say we can do it. And And it's not just that Washington ordered the inoculation of the soldiers that's significant. It's like you said, that he had the capacity to learn, to change his mind, to shift positions, and very quickly thereafter it goes just as well or even better than the doctors expected. Washington, for the rest of his life, is an absolute zealot for inoculation. Thinks everyone should do it. He recommends that all Virginian families inoculate their children. He reflects upon it, and he says, I just don't understand how it took me so long to do it.
On the other side of the scale is a man who I don't want to call a scoundrel, somewhat shadowy figure, James Latham. And he seems to permeate your book. He shows up in many places. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on James Latham?
Latham's my favorite guy in the book. I mentioned how Waterhouse created a sort of vaccination franchise system. Well, he might have gotten the idea from James Latham. James Latham was a British physician who started in Canada, establishing his own inoculation business. He advertised in the Canadian newspapers for it, but there wasn't that much demand in Canada. In the early 1770s, he comes to New York and he opens inoculation franchises. And he was just a master of using newspapers and using advertisements. If grad students may know this, or if you look at the colonial newspaper database and you Google or you search for Latham, you'll come up with hundreds of his advertisements for. He opened hospitals at first in New York City, but they grew so large that he opened several of them, and then he started a franchise system. But the thing about Latham was, he said that he used secret ingredients, secret medicines that nobody else had, right? He used secret techniques that no one else used. He said he borrowed them from a doctor named Sutton in England, who was doing a similar thing in England. There's no connection that I found between them, except that Latham claims to be a Suttonian inoculator. Brags he's never lost a patient, that his patients don't get any pox upon them, that everything is the safest and the best. He's also charges the least of anybody in the colonies because he opens all of these franchises across the colonies. He works with a network of doctors. To call yourself to get Latham's secret medicines that he sends to his doctors without any ingredient labels on them, right? To get them, you would have to pledge 50% of your earnings and send that to Latham along with an upfront fee. So the Latham franchises grows. There are a number of them throughout New England. There's a controversy in Salem, Massachusetts, because they hire Latham himself to come be their inoculator. And as so often, he isn't quite what he advertises. He's not so successful in Salem. It causes a big controversy. And Salem had been a loyalist town, known for being its close connections to the crown. And this was in 1774, so right before the Revolution. Latham very much models himself as a British gentleman. And the people in the town start saying, all British people are like this. They steal an American idea, which they think inoculation was American at this point, and they sell it back to us, at a greater cost. They're killing us off. They don't care about it at all. And this Latham controversy really spills into the Revolution itself. The primary opponents of Dr. Latham become some of the most significant figures in Salem history. Timothy Pickering, if you know him, was the chief adversary of Dr. Latham. Dr. Latham then leaves Salem in disgrace, and he goes into Boston, and he tries to sort of build up his reputation, because Latham isn't a dedicated loyalist. He just wants to make money, and so he realizes that he kind of needs both sides of to want to visit his hospitals, and so he makes deals with Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams Jr., who is a doctor. They're going to build hospitals together. They're working on their own hospital system. It's Latham who gives reports to Boston's selectmen and Boston's town meetings saying, you know what, in some of these British barracks, they've got smallpox and they're not telling you about it. And right before the battles of Lexington and Concord, Latham has given reports to Bostonians that the British Army is inoculating illegally, which is against the rules in Boston. You have to do all this very publicly. And it's another one of the controversies that's brewing right before Lexington and Concord. And it's all in newspapers, but it's not commonly in history books that Bostonians are also angry about public health, that the British soldiers, British officers are not following the local public health rules. And it's a big problem because the selectmen of Boston can't quarantine British soldiers. It's difficult for them. An average citizen who gets smallpox would be taken to a hospital, a quarantine hospital, or would have their house fenced in and watched. Well, what happens when a British soldier does it? Can the city actually quarantine these guys? And it's such a problem. When the last town meeting before Lexington and Concord wasn't about tea, it wasn't about gunpowder, it was about smallpox. It was revealed at that meeting that there were far more smallpox cases in Boston than had been reported, that the British had been withholding the number of people with smallpox. There were about 40 at least cases. Usually in Boston, if there's 20 cases, they would call for a general inoculation. The whole city would shut down while the community inoculates. It would last a couple of months. In that meeting, they don't vote to go into inoculation. Instead, about 2 weeks later, the British Army goes out. Paul Revere puts the two lanterns in Old North Church. And so one of the questions in my book, so what if they had called for an inoculation there in April of 1775? It certainly would have changed the timeline of things. Governor Gage might have had a better opportunity to cool things off in Boston during such a time, but they don't go for it. Anyway, that's one of my complaints. I've been walking around town the last couple of days on the Freedom Trail. There's no mention of smallpox, no mention of inoculation. There's no statue of Onesimus, right, anywhere. So maybe we can change it.
Did Latham use mercury?
He said he didn't, right? So that was the secret ingredients of Latham. Usually, inoculators at this time were using mercury as a medicine, which obviously did terrible damage to people. John Adams blamed his doses of mercury that he took in preparation for his inoculation for his tooth problems later in life, because it makes your gums and it makes your teeth really loose. He said his teeth ended up worse than George Washington's. It's hard to believe.
It's very difficult.
Yeah. So mercury was being used by doctors. Latham said that his technique did not require mercury, but instead he had secret medicines. And so, and it goes into detail, but another doctor, John Warren, who was Joseph Warren's brother, gets a hold of some of Latham's secret medicines and does a chemical analysis of them and discovers, it's mercury. You're using the same thing as everybody else. It's part of what shows Latham as this fraud. They're all using it. I mean, there's some ancient ideas about mercury as a medicine. It had been used to help cure the great pox or syphilis. So it was still being used by inoculators, especially the really high-priced inoculators that would use mercury. When they inoculated soldiers during the Revolution, and they did it really quickly and en masse, I don't think most soldiers were taking mercury. I think they were doing it without, and I think they realized that you didn't really need it during the operation. But Latham was.
There are some, if I can say, somewhat lighter moments in your book. And I think of Ashley Bowen, probably known to this audience. He kept a diary which was published some years ago. And Ashley Bowen was apparently posted at the gate to Marblehead, and he had the key to the lock. And his task was to examine everyone coming into Marblehead to see if they had any kind of evidence of smallpox. And apparently he would then smoke them.
Yeah.
If you might explain what smoking was.
So just first, I should thank the Colonial Society because in publishing the diaries of Ashley Bowen, it allowed somebody like me who's working from not Northeastern but Northwestern, far away from most Boston archives and things, to discover this. So this sailor in Marblehead took meticulous effort in writing journals from the 1760s through the 1790s, early 1800s, I think, almost every day, and often wrote a lot. Some diarists, if we've got historians in the room, only write about the weather or just a couple of words. But Bowen wrote quite a bit in his journals, and that's how I got started on the project, was reading Ashley Bowen's journals, and he's not talking about tea, he's not talking about Stamp Act or any of these other controversies, but he really gets worked up about smallpox and the controversy in his community. And he takes on all these odd jobs in his community. He wants to he's not an ordinary sailor. He's retired from a sailing career. His father was I don't know if he was a lawyer, but he was certainly a town leader of sorts. And Ashley Bowen takes on this job, and he agrees to work the town gates. So Marblehead, like it does today, there's only one road in, and they had a gate across it. And during an epidemic, when Boston would have an epidemic, Marblehead would close its town gates, and Ashley Bowen would meet visitors there, and they would be subject to smoking. So there was a little sentry box, a little shed, where visitors would have to go in. Some accounts say that there were holes carved in the wall, so you'd stick your head through it, and they'd fill the room with smoke, sulfur smoke, extra stinky stuff, and that was thought to sort of dry out any smallpox material that might be on your clothes or on your body. I suspect that it didn't do much, but the fact that you're getting inspected, that you're going to have to go through this process, would probably keep you, if you had any kind of illness or sickness, it would probably keep you home. It actually worked really well. Marblehead didn't often have epidemics come from Boston, and because they were doing these inspections, they certainly would look if you've got pox on your face. They'd notice that too. But they kept doing it. And so he would smoke everybody who came to town, whether it was Elbridge Gerry or slaves, women. Everyone was subject to smoking. There were a couple of episodes where people tried to avoid it, and he would have to track them down. Late at night, someone tried to avoid it, and he had to, wake the constable to chase this person down that avoided the smoking. But he did it in several different epidemics. It must have been a job that he enjoyed. I don't know.
Just one last question, then the audience might wish to ask some questions. It seems to me, in the latter part of your book, and certainly in the conclusion, that the interest in vaccination for smallpox declines. You would think that given the experience of the 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, that people would be more conscious of it, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
Look at how interest in vaccination is maybe declining today, even though there's been an introduction of an amazing new vaccine technology and mRNA vaccines. And I don't know if that's an answer to that question, but we can see in our own time how vaccination can decline. The measles vaccine, we've seen a lower uptake of, and measles outbreaks again, even though we know of the success. So part of it, I think, is that when we vaccinate or inoculate populations, we feel safe from it and then feel like we don't have to continue it. With smallpox, soon after the revolution into the 1790s, there's a new disease that's much more dangerous, that's much more scary, that breaks out called yellow fever. In Philadelphia, the capital of the U.S., has a terrible yellow fever epidemic in 1793. It kills 10% of Philadelphia's population, like 5,000 people. And yellow fever, nobody knows how it spreads. It doesn't work like smallpox. Smallpox, they had pretty well figured out that it was a contagious disease and you could protect against it through inoculation. Yellow fever seems to strike randomly. Some people in a household get sick from it, other people don't. One house gets struck, the house across the street doesn't. Doctors can treat yellow fever patients and don't get sick. Whereas a doctor treats a smallpox patient, they're going to get smallpox too if they haven't had it already. So yellow fever, I think, is a big reason. I think it breaks the brains of a lot of people about how disease works. They start getting a more fatalistic view that doctors can't do anything, medicine can't solve our problems, city governments, why would we invest in vaccinating the public when there's this other more dangerous disease that we have no cure for? And so I think that's where some of the interest dies down. Smallpox is no longer as feared because vaccination exists. There's a general thought that if you want to be vaccinated, that you can go out and get it, that parents can get it if they want it. But there are other diseases and dangers out there, and these kind of citywide campaigns, which I talk about in my book over inoculation, quickly die out. They have to be spurred on later. Only when there's a new smallpox outbreak do you start getting more people calling for vaccinations again. But there was a moment in the 1790s where, again, people from around the world thought that the United States would be the place that would wipe out smallpox. There's an amazing letter that George Washington gets from a German physician where he says, "I must congratulate you on your revolution. I've read the Declaration of Independence. I see that you have ended slavery in your country because I saw that you've said all men are created equal." And that's what the German doctor says. From afar, it looks like they've done it. And he says, soon America will have second merit of being the first country to eliminate smallpox. And that this would be how the United States would be known. And he's received records from Boston and Newport, Rhode Island, where there were inoculation campaigns. And he just said, soon America's going to get rid of it. And it seems like they're right on the cusp of it. And then for all these other reasons that I've said, Americans sort of stop doing it or slow down. There's another reason in the South, which we hadn't mentioned much of, and that is because enslavers largely did not want to pay for the inoculations of their slaves or the vaccinations of their slaves. And so largely they would not. Even though it was available to them, in some ways you might think that this would be a way to sort of protect your investment in human beings. But in general, enslavers did not want to do it. They did not want to pay this cost. So there are these large pockets of people, poor people, enslaved people across the United States who are being prevented from getting vaccination, which has some echoes, I think, currently about who's sort of left out of public health and who gets included.
Did you say echoes?
Sure.
Well, why don't I stop there? 'Cause I'm sure the audience might have some questions. Bob?
No,
Yeah.
there are questions. We have a microphone.
Oh, okay.
All right, sir, two questions. First of all, how... Oh, sorry. So the number of cases, say, in the South, where the plantations were somewhat isolated, sort of the risk of exposure, even becoming sick. And then, interesting, could you give us some idea when you talk about the cost and how doctors were extracting too much, what were they charging and sort of relative to what people were making?
Yeah, so on the cost part of it, it's a little bit hard sometimes to do those calculations because a doctor would charge £5 for inoculation, and you have to think about, well, how much would that cost today? And some of those inflation calculators and things don't really work for this time period, and there wasn't as much money to go around. So the best way to look at it is to kind of look at annual earnings. So for Ashley Bowen, Marblehead, this hospital that they built in Marblehead, was the most expensive place to get inoculated in the colonies. They charged £5, 15 shillings to get inoculated. Bowen, he kept such great records that you could see his sort of his earnings year after year. A typical year for Ashley Bowen, he made £40 in a year. And so at about £6 to get vaccinated, that's a significant portion of your annual income. And then you imagine Ashley Bowen had a wife and 5 kids. It would cost more than his annual income to be inoculated. So we're talking like, the cost of a car or something like that, equivalent in terms of what most people earn. So it could be that expensive. Latham charged about £3. He was less, but it was still expensive. And then some communities would offer free inoculations if you could prove your poverty, if you could go and get certified that you were poor enough, you could get a free inoculation or vaccination. But of course, few people actually want to go through the embarrassment or difficulty of having the city leaders certify that you're poor enough to get free vaccination. So that was always an issue as well. That's why Milton came up with this plan, and they said, look, 25 cents. Everybody pays 25 cents. We can give the doctor enough money from the whole town chipping in 25 cents. He makes plenty of money, and then everybody can afford it. Rich and poor alike can afford this 25-cent fee. So there were ideas and plans to try to make this cheaper. It didn't have to be that expensive. The procedure itself just takes having a little bit of smallpox matter or having a little bit of cowpox and a scalpel and a bandage. It didn't take a lot. So like when the Continental Army does it, it doesn't cost them £5 a piece to inoculate whole regiments of soldiers.
Another question in the audience?
You said that there was a quarantine hospital in Boston before the revolution in 1775. Where was it? On one of the islands? Or
There were island hospitals. That was often, especially in coastal Massachusetts, where they would put quarantine hospitals or inoculation hospitals to keep them away. So they're on Castle Island. I don't know the name of it. Castle William. Rainsford Island. There was a quarantine station as well. And then within Boston, because it was much more convenient to take patients to, they established a hospital in West Boston. I don't know exactly how to pinpoint it, but they would call it New Boston or West Boston in the notes, and that's where they would take people to, starting in the 1750s. It was, I believe, it was a private home that the town leased for that purpose, and then eventually, instead of leasing it, they just bought the building.
Following up on that, I wonder whether this quarantine hospital in West Boston was close to the new almshouse that had been moved from Park Street to West Boston, which would be the West End as we would know it
Right.
today.
It's likely, yes, and that there were always complaints about when these things move into the neighborhood, but smallpox was pretty easily contained. If you had a guard outside the hospital all the time, and patients were not allowed to leave, visitors were not allowed to come in. They proved over the decades that smallpox in these quarantine hospitals could do the job if they were well regulated, and so there weren't frequent outbreaks from the hospital from patients.
I think we have time for one more question, please. Sorry.
This might be related to that. I have ancestors that were in Morristown at the time of Washington's troops and inoculation, and I've been told that the church that they attended was one of their hospital sites, and one of them died within that spring. So I've always wondered, was there a fear of contagion into the residents of Morristown in the process of the Army being inoculated?
Yes, I just gave a talk to Morristown people anyway recently. But George Washington had a meeting with local leaders about this happening. The town of Morristown, they weren't anti-vaxxers. It was just that they didn't. Introducing inoculation to all these soldiers would be hard to contain it. And Washington agreed that if any community members opened up their homes, opened up their churches to soldiers under inoculation, that the Army doctors would also inoculate the public in Morristown. They'd also inoculate civilians for free. And so there were lots of families that invited soldiers into their home. They all inoculated together. There were church congregations that got together and inoculated with soldiers. But it's true. But still, it was contagious and it did spread. So I think that was in 1777, and I think 60 people in Morristown, civilians, died from smallpox that year. It seemed like it was already breaking out before Washington issued his order within Morristown. Might have affected some of his decision making. But yeah, it was a dangerous undertaking. And so yeah, I mean, that what you described totally fits. That that's something that could have happened.
I hope they didn't smoke you before you.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much. I think, like all good history, you reach into the past to tell us something about the present. So thank you for coming. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.